The signal in the void. Adan had been cruising through the depths of space, far from the bustling trade routes and planetary systems he often visited. His ship, the Horizon's Reach, was an aging but reliable freighter, equipped for long-haul travel and the occasional task of harvesting fuel from gas giants. He had been refining fuel for the last few days, his only company the hum of machinery and the infinite void stretching out before him. The job was mundane, but necessary. The gas giant's atmosphere was thick with energy-rich gases, perfect for harvesting the fuel required to power his ship's jump drive. It was a routine task, a time for his mind to wander while the ship did the work. But as he drifted through the quiet emptiness, a small, almost imperceptible anomaly broke the monotonous calm. It started as a faint static disturbance on his long-range observational array. At first, Adan didn't give it much thought. Static and interference were common in deep space, especially in uncharted regions. It was the nature of space itself, a constant hum of electromagnetic radiation and particles that distorted signals. But this static wasn't like the usual noise. It was too rhythmic, too regular to be the normal random distortions. Something in the pattern caught Adan's attention. Curiosity, a trait he had learned to trust during his years as a lone contractor, made him investigate further. He manipulated the controls of his ship's sensor array, isolating the anomaly from the rest of the feed. As the data displayed on his screen, he felt a jolt of surprise. The static had cleared, and instead, an image began to form, a blurry, fractured picture, but one that was unmistakably human. It showed figures in distress, moving erratically inside what appeared to be a small craft. Adan's heart raced as he watched the image sharpen, revealing flashes of sparks, smoke trailing from the ship's corridors, and the frantic gestures of the humanoids aboard. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. These people were in trouble. A lot of trouble. He switched to the audio feed, but all he could hear were garbled voices, faint and indistinct. The distress was palpable, however, fear in every crackle, in every strained transmission. The humanoid figures moved desperately around the cabin, clearly trying to address some catastrophic failure. Adan instinctively adjusted his focus, attempting to identify their vessel. It wasn't anything he recognized, a small beaten-down craft, barely holding itself together in the cold void of space. It looked barely able to withstand the harsh environment, much less navigate through it. Despite the interference in the signal, Adan could tell that this wasn't just a simple mechanical issue. This was a ship in critical condition, a crew in danger of being lost in the void unless someone intervened. As his mind raced, a grim realization set in. If no one came for them, these beings would die in deep space, alone and helpless, floating endlessly until their ship's systems failed completely. Adan glanced over at the navigation panel, his fingers hovering over the controls. He had been refining fuel for the past few days, and the ship was nearly ready for the next jump in his cargo route. The next stop was a high-priority delivery, one that would ensure he met the terms of his contract. It was the kind of job that paid well and kept him in good standing with his clients. But now, another choice lay before him. He could continue his journey, fulfill his contract, and leave these strangers to their fate, or he could risk everything, his time, his cargo, and his contract, to help them. He weighed the options in his mind. It would take a few days of detour, certainly, but he had enough refined fuel to make a quick jump to their location and still get back on track afterward. The delay would be minimal. The question was whether he could live with the knowledge that he had turned his back on someone in need, especially if he had the means to help. Adan didn't hesitate for long. His decision was made. Engaging the skip drive, Adan set the coordinates to the signal's origin. The ship's engines hummed to life as the vast expanse of space began to warp around him. In an instant, the Horizon's Reach tore through the fabric of reality, leaping from one point in space to another. The jump was swift, and within less than a day, he emerged from the fold of space into the vicinity of the damaged craft. He felt a brief jolt as the ship's systems reoriented, and there it was, the vessel that had sent the distress signal. It was smaller than his own ship, perhaps half its size, but it was clearly in no condition to fly. The craft was floating lifelessly in space, an eerie silence surrounding it. The occasional spark erupted from various parts of its hull, and the glow of dim emergency lights flickered from within. The sight of it tugged at something inside Adan, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Empathy. He activated his external sensors, scanning for signs of life. The readings were faint, but there was a pulse. Someone was alive aboard the damaged ship. His heart skipped a beat. The situation was even worse than he had initially thought. The craft's damaged state made it look like it had been drifting for much longer than it had. The crew's survival was not guaranteed. Adan knew he couldn't waste time. He immediately transmitted a signal to the craft, hoping to establish communication and assess the situation further. He didn't know who these people were or where they came from, but they needed help, and Adan couldn't ignore that. Through the static, a voice finally crackled through. It was weak, but the words were clear enough. "Please, help us." A simple plea, yet it was all that was needed to stir Adan's determination. He began the process of approaching the ship, preparing to offer assistance in any way he could. Little did he know that his decision would change the course of his life forever. This was no ordinary rescue mission. This was the beginning of something far greater. And as Adan prepared to board the mysterious vessel, he couldn't shake the feeling that these beings were about to introduce him to a reality beyond anything he had ever known. He just hoped they would still be alive when he got there. The arrival. Adan's fingers flew over the console as he made the final adjustments to his ship's trajectory. The Horizon's Reach, once a reliable vessel for long-haul cargo runs, now felt like a lifeline to a group of unknown strangers. Stranded in the cold silence of deep space, his heart beat steadily as the seconds ticked away, knowing that the lives aboard the derelict ship were hanging by a thread. His mind was a blur of thoughts as he navigated closer to the vessel. The strange craft's silhouette loomed larger on his viewport. Even from this distance, it was clear that the ship had suffered extensive damage. The once pristine hull was now scorched and riddled with holes, likely from a series of violent impacts or energy bursts. Adan could see the emergency lights flickering faintly within the craft, casting an eerie glow across the dark void. He engaged the docking protocols, ensuring the two ships would be able to connect without issue. The control panels lit up in response, sending signals back and forth between the Horizon's Reach and the damaged vessel. The systems hummed as the airlock doors opened, and Adan steeled himself. There was no going back now. He wasn't just offering a helping hand. He was about to step into the unknown. He suited up quickly, donning the standard spacesuit that provided protection against the vacuum of space and the unknown conditions he would likely encounter aboard the failing ship. The suit's seal was tight, and the helmet's visor reflected the dim light outside, casting his face in shadow. Adan took a deep breath, his exhale a soft hiss inside the helmet. Despite the routine nature of his work, he never liked boarding unknown ships. But something about this mission felt different. His instinct told him that there was something more to this distress call than a simple mechanical failure. As Adan sealed his helmet, he activated the magnetic boots of his suit, which would anchor him to the surface of the ship during his walk across the void. With a final glance at the display showing the status of both ships, he opened the airlock and floated into space. The cold silence of the void surrounded him. The only sound was the faint hum of his suit's life support systems. Adan moved methodically toward the derelict ship, his magnetic boots ensuring he could move easily despite the lack of gravity. The closer he got, the more he could see of the damage. Some parts of the ship were scorched black, as if from a powerful explosion. Others were punctured, exposing the inner hull to the vacuum outside. Yet the ship still held together, barely. There were signs of life inside, but the power was flickering, and the danger of further structural collapse was ever present. He reached the hatchway, the only apparent means of entry into the craft. Aiden's fingers trembled slightly as he approached the sealed door. The distress signal had been strong enough to reach him from far across the stars, but the closer he got, the more the desperation of the situation sank in. There were no communications to clarify the situation, no confirmation of who they were, what had happened, or why their ship had fallen apart so suddenly. Only the faint, broken words begging for help. He pressed his gloved hand to the ship's surface, activating the docking mechanism on his suit. The interface on his wrist buzzed, syncing with the vessel's internal systems. He waited for a moment, listening intently to the click of mechanisms unlocking and the faint hiss of the ship's failing life support systems struggling to keep the air breathable. The hatch finally opened with a low groan, revealing the dark interior of the ship beyond. Inside, the air was thick, stale with the scent of ozone, and something more acrid. Aiden's eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, and he stepped carefully inside, boots clicking against the cold metal floor. The faint whine of malfunctioning lights echoed through the narrow corridor. In front of him, a thin mist hung in the air, a byproduct of the damaged atmosphere controls. He made his way through the ship's dimly lit hallways, following the sound of muffled voices. Every few steps, a flash of light would flicker overhead, causing the shadows to shift erratically. The whole structure felt unstable, as if it were ready to collapse under the strain of its failing systems. The first humanoid he encountered was collapsed on the floor just ahead, their figure outlined in the dim light. A flash of sparks erupted from a broken conduit above, lighting up the face of the figure, a young woman, her features tense and strained, clearly struggling to breathe as the remaining air supply grew thinner. She was covered in smudge, oily black marks, her clothing torn, and her eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. Her hand reached out weakly as she noticed him approaching. Aiden rushed forward, kneeling beside her. He knew there wasn't much time. Her breathing was labored, and her skin was pale. It was clear that she'd been exposed to more than just the ship's failing systems. She had endured something far worse. We need help. Not much time left," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of static from nearby damaged speakers. Her words were cut off by a coughing fit. Aiden looked around, assessing the situation. He reached into a compartment on his suit and pulled out an emergency oxygen supply kit, connecting it to her mask. The woman's labored breathing gradually steadied as the oxygen filled her lungs. "I've got you," Aiden reassured her, even though his heart was racing. "I'm getting you out of here." But just as he began to help her to her feet, a loud rumble shook the ship, sending both of them staggering. The lights flickered wildly, and the whole vessel seemed to groan in protest. Aiden could hear the crackling of alarms from somewhere deeper within the ship. He looked around quickly. He needed to move. This place wasn't safe anymore. "We have to move. Now," Aiden said, his voice firm, but the woman's weak response confirmed his fear. "I'm not sure how long we can last," she gasped. Aiden's mind raced. The ship's instability was worsening, and the damage was more severe than he had anticipated. He couldn't risk staying here too long. But he needed to find out who else was aboard and how to help them. The woman pointed weakly to the hallway further down. "There, in the control room." Aiden nodded, grabbing her arm to steady her as he helped her walk down the corridor. The journey was slow, each step measured, and every noise made his nerves edge higher. But there was no turning back now. The control room was just ahead, but Aiden had no idea what he was about to walk into. He had come for a simple rescue, but he felt the weight of something far greater than that. Whoever these people were, they were in his debt now. And, in a galaxy filled with uncertainty, he wasn't sure just how far the debt would stretch. As the control room doors slid open, a sharp, urgent voice cut through the air. "Who are you?" the voice demanded. Aiden stood there, facing the unknown and prepared for whatever would come next. The desperate truth. The control room was a dimly lit, chaotic mess of malfunctioning displays, flickering lights, and scattered tools. The air was thick with a faint metallic smell, mixed with the acrid scent of burning circuitry. The low hum of the ship's failing power systems buzzed in the background, the only noise that filled the tense silence that had followed the question. Aden stood motionless in the doorway, staring at the group of figures gathered around the central console, each one with a look of disbelief and fear as they turned toward him. A man, his face pale and covered in grease, was the first to step forward. His eyes were wild, pupils dilated, and the lines around his face suggested a long history of stress and hardship. His clothes were ripped, stained with sweat, and his breathing was shallow. But despite the dire circumstances, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, a hope that had almost been extinguished by the ship's slow descent into disaster. You're here to help us?" the man asked, his voice thick with exhaustion, but tinged with disbelief. His tone suggested that no one had come to their aid in a long time, and the hope that had once been there seemed to be fading with every passing moment. Aden nodded, taking a slow step into the room, his boots echoing softly on the metal floor. He quickly scanned the group, noting their condition. The woman he had helped earlier was now leaning against the wall, her face still pale but breathing more easily thanks to the oxygen mask. There were two other humanoids with her. One was a tall, broad-shouldered figure, with dark skin and silver markings on his face, his posture rigid with tension. The other was smaller, with short, choppy hair and wide, nervous eyes that darted from Aden to the broken ship's controls. "Yes, I'm here to help, but we need to move fast," Aden replied, his voice steady but urgent. "This ship is barely holding together, and you don't have much time." The man nodded gravely, glancing over at the central console, which was now flashing red and emitting a high-pitched warning. "It's a mess," he said. "We've been stranded here for almost a week. The engines failed, and then we lost our navigation systems. There's no power to keep the life support running, and—" He broke off, swallowing hard as the reality of their situation seemed to hit him again. "Why didn't you send out a distress signal earlier?" Aden asked, his tone sharper now. He could feel the tension rising, the pressure mounting on him to get answers. There was more going on here than just a mechanical failure. The man looked down, his fists clenching. "We did," he said softly, "but the signal's been intermittent. Most of it was lost before we could even get a proper call-out. We tried everything: jump drives, backup comms, emergency protocols. But nothing worked." He turned to the smaller figure near the console. "Tell him," he said quietly, his voice shaking. The smaller humanoid, a female, stepped forward hesitantly. Her hands were shaking, but she steadied herself and took a deep breath. "We weren't just stranded," she said, her voice filled with sorrow. "The engine failure wasn't an accident. It was sabotage." A sudden silence filled the room. The word hung in the air like a heavy weight. Aden's mind immediately raced, analyzing the implications. Sabotage. This wasn't just a ship malfunction or an unlucky event. Someone had intentionally crippled their vessel. "Sabotage," Aden repeated, his brow furrowed in confusion. "By who? Why?" The woman swallowed hard, her gaze darting nervously between the others. "We were carrying something valuable, something classified. A cargo shipment from the Asari Confederacy. We were under strict orders to deliver it to a secure location on Cylon 5, but we never made it. Someone on board, someone from our own crew, sabotaged us before we even left the orbit of our last stop. We're not sure who. And that's why we can't call for help, because whoever did this will make sure we never get to talk to anyone about it." Aden felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary rescue. This was a conspiracy, a betrayal, right in the heart of the crew. And now, it was a matter of survival. He didn't know who had sabotaged them or why, but if the cargo was valuable enough to kill for, it meant that someone out there was willing to do anything to prevent its delivery. The man stepped forward again, his voice trembling. We've been trying to fix things, but everything is failing. The ship's integrity is compromised, and we can't keep the systems running for much longer. We have to get out of here before the hull breaches or the atmosphere goes critical." His eyes locked onto Adon's, pleading, "Please, you have to help us. We're all that's left." The rest of the crew, they didn't make it. Adon looked around at the remaining survivors, his mind racing. He couldn't leave them to die in this broken ship. The decision had already been made the moment he had decided to answer the distress call, but now he was facing a much bigger problem. They weren't just stranded. They were in the middle of something far more dangerous than a simple ship malfunction. The sabotage, the cargo, the looming threat from whoever was behind this. It was all connected. "I can help," Adon said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. "But we need to stabilize the ship, find the sabotage, and get it fixed. I won't be able to pull you out of here if it's going to fall apart on us before we get to safety." The man looked at him, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and apprehension. "You're right, but we don't have much time. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it gets." Adon turned toward the ship's damaged systems, calculating what needed to be done. He was no engineer, but he had enough knowledge of ship repairs to get them started. They needed to get the power back online, find out exactly what had been sabotaged, and get the life support systems running again. It wasn't going to be easy, but Adon wasn't about to leave them stranded. He'd already made his choice. He glanced back at the survivors. "We need to work together," he said. "I'll take care of the systems. You keep the others safe and make sure no one else sabotages the ship further." The woman nodded, her expression one of determination. The others followed suit, standing tall despite the fear that still lingered in their eyes. And so, the small group began to work, each person performing their part to keep the ship from falling apart completely. But as they did, Adon couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just trying to survive the ship's impending collapse. They were running out of time to uncover the truth behind the sabotage. Something much bigger was at play here, and if they didn't get to the bottom of it soon, they might not live long enough to see another sunrise.